off-season, transition phase, detraining, or simply taking a break. Whatever you want to call it, it's a thing. And it's an important thing for every athlete. Time away from always having the pressure to perform at races, events, or just hard interval sessions can take a toll on the mind and body. The benefits of detraining are there for time-rich athletes as well as time-crunched athletes. And to help explain how best to detrain, I've brought in ultra-running coach and director of coaching at CTS, Cliff Pittman. Cliff, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate you having me on. I'd just like to point out that you have this remarkable podcast voice, and so I'm going to bring something a little bit on the other end of the spectrum.
Well, yeah, I can tell that your comedy relief is spot on today, Cliff. So thank you for bringing that to the party. My opening question, though, first is: have you recovered from your bike ride that you had last week when we last talked?
Oh, the 1 hour bike ride? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you're a runner. I don't know how you guys recover from all that, but
thank you for bringing the comedy here as well. I have recovered, but I figured if I was going to be speaking to this audience and having a chance of having a competent conversation, that I better go ride on a bike for at least 1 hour.
Perfect. Yeah, you are walking the talk, man. Well, Cliff, for those who don't know you like I know you, can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, so I think we just covered it that I'm not a cyclist.
Yep.
I am a runner. I have a background in coaching specifically within ultra running. Also worked with a lot of military athletes in a previous life. And like you mentioned, I'm the director of coaching at CTS. So I have the wonderful opportunity to work with coaches like yourself and learn a lot from you guys as well.
Yeah, herding the cattle of coaches, it's not a small task, but Cliff does it well, and he knows this thing from the coaching side of things. So, thank you again for coming on the podcast. And you are also a very time crunched person now that you've taken on that role at CTS. So we'll, in the spirit of time crunchness, we will get the party going here on the podcast.
Speaking of time crunch, I failed to mention I do have 4 kids, so that factors in too.
There you go. That's the vice of it all. So let's get to it, Cliff. It's my opinion that all athletes need a break over the course of a year, even time crunched athletes. So 2 questions to you. Would you agree with that, number 1? And 2, why do we need that break?
Yeah, absolutely. So I agree 100%. There's really multiple components here. If we look at it from the physical aspect, just in day-to-day training, there's a stress and rest concept, right? Overload and recovery, where we're applying stress to the body or to the specific system, and then we need ample time to recover from that. So we see that on a very micro scale, whether it's in a particular workout like an interval structured workout, day to day where we keep our hard days hard or easy days easy, block to block where we have hard blocks, and then even recovery phases, and then today, like we're discussing detraining on like an off season, where it's on a much more macro scale where we take the foot off the gas pedal and then just allow our body and our mind to go through this reset.
And I think, on the physical end of things, there's some metrics and aspects that we can measure, and we'll get into a little bit today. On the mental side of things, it's a little bit more abstract. We can't measure those stresses. We simply talk through them. But on the mental side of things, I mean, what do you find in your athletes that are being, quote, reset for an athlete between the ears when you take a period of detraining or some time away?
A good training cycle will, like we talked about on the physical side, apply some good stress to elicit those adaptations that we're going for, ultimately increasing fitness and performance. That can be very psychologically demanding. Just the amount of time invested, the amount of intensity required in some of those workouts, and then just a shift of responsibilities. Because if you're investing a lot into that training process, then ultimately there's going to be some sacrifices made. Sometimes that's family, time with family. Sometimes that's even on the work front, or maybe we're just neglecting some standard hobbies that we have in our life. And so I find that this structured detraining or off season is really important on the mental side of things, just because athletes have the opportunity to find some semblance of balance in their life again and reinvest in a lot of those things that may have been neglected throughout the last training cycle.
Yeah, and so I think the reality is like there's no need to grind away 12 months out of the year on training, right? Just like the hard in day out trying to build everything. If you do it well and take an intentional time period to reset, it helps to find that balance, and it can help you move beyond where the fitness and the performance was in the year prior. Um, and so that's what we're going to really talk about today. And so moving on here, though, Cliff, do you find that there's a difference between time crunched athletes and time rich athletes? Meaning, do the time rich athletes need a harder break or a longer break, or in the time crunch don't? Or are you giving it to both of them?
Yeah, I give it to both of them, but certainly the duration will depend a lot on training history.
Hmm.
So the obvious answer is if an athlete's training 20 plus hours a week, they're going to require a little bit longer time to decompress, detrain, reset than an athlete who's training maybe 7 to 10 hours a week. But I think that it certainly depends too on lifestyle and other factors.
Yeah.
And it's really important how we look at athletes holistically. That's what a good coach
Hmm.
does. And so I think that there's a lot of nuances between time crunched and time rich athletes. I believe the way you described it there,
Hmm.
where sometimes there can be a little bit of a crossover, maybe a little bit of balance where some might look very similar despite their training history just because of lifestyle factors.
For our audience members, if you're looking for some, global overarching answer, the, the answer is yeah, take a break, but a lot of this varies. So I'd say we'll get into the weeds of it now, and I'll first recap an episode I did last year, episode number 120. It's called Detraining. And in there, I get fairly heavy on some of the research and the data from Mujica about how to set up a good and intentional detraining phase. I'm just going to hit some bullet points, and then I'm going to have Cliff just kind of riff off of that. So in that episode, what I determined Coach AP's recipe for detraining, and both taking the research and taking my athletes and observing what I do, is it's a 3 to 4 week dedicated time period of detraining. I take 1 week completely off the bike, and you just do nothing. Complete getting away from all the training. Maybe some light walking, but definitely chilling out, sleeping more, and just being a human being. And then I have 2 weeks of shorter aerobic rides, and then I'll incorporate in something else like hiking, yoga, walking, just very unstructured movement. And I decrease frequency, for every athlete. So if you are used to riding 6 days per week, I'll knock it down to 3 or 4, and incorporate some of that other stuff. Finally, in the fourth week, I'll get frequency back up there, frequency of riding, and we're back to good habits with sleep and food and all this kind of stuff, but volume's still fairly low, intensity's controlled. And then I'll start to go into our base time period. So that fourth week is like a transition within the transition phase of moving on to base. um, so that was my Coach AP's recipe of how I do it. Cliff, do you do something similar with your runners, or am I like wildly off base here?
Yeah, no, it's actually like to the T, very very textbook as to how we would do it with runners as well. I think the only nuance there is just when we factor in the individual component too, like we just discussed, just looking at the athlete holistically. Certainly have certain athletes that will um, need some like very over structure to their detraining phase to make sure that they are coloring within the lines, and then some, you can just give them some very broad parameters to work within. In general, I like the latter because I think that's kind of a good time frame for athletes to have a little bit of structure, but be able to kind of explore other modalities and kind of fill in the gaps. And so, usually within that like third, fourth week, especially second and third week, probably I'm just giving some parameters to work within. Go out, explore a different mode, whether it's running, if you're a cyclist, maybe it's running, hiking, walking, swimming for up to an hour.
And for the data nerds out there and the OCD technical people, when we're talking detraining, we're talking a very intentional fitness loss. Okay, and that definition is coming from Bosque and Mojica in their research, and the definition is a loss of performance adaptations which occur by a reduction or cessation of training. So yeah, to our listeners, we're telling you, take it down a notch. Okay. And for our cyclists, and I'll be curious, Cliff, when you're monitoring like CTL and some other metrics on your end, maybe what you're aiming for. But on the cycling side of things, and I never really prescribe this, I'm more or less like tell the athlete what to do and then look and see what happened. But I'm aiming for around 20 to 30% reduction in CTL over the 3 to 4 week time period. And that means if you're running a CTL of 75 right now, over 3 to 4 weeks, you're probably down in the 50 or 60 TSS per day for a CTL. So, but then if you have a higher CTL, meaning you're like in the 120s right now, you can actually drop it a little bit lower, meaning you can go like 30 to 40% reduction, and then you start building back up. So Cliff, do you look at some of those metrics or numbers similarly, or do you have another like thing that you're looking at?
Yeah, very similarly. I would say that we're on the trail and ultra running side, we're a lot less sophisticated than you guys. And so, we
You're
don't
tougher though. You're tougher.
and so, we don't do a whole lot of prescribing based on CTL just because there's so many variables that can negatively influence CTL with changing surfaces and different environments and such. But
Right.
we definitely take the exact same approach with just a total volume and duration measured in hours.
Just kind of a recap of the detraining technical stuff for audience members is yes, we want you to get less fit. Yes, we want you to do less. Yes, we want you to get away from your bike and your running shoes and all this kind of stuff. And it's going to be healthier in the long run.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to that, Adam. Just that sounds scary, right? Especially for those of us that are
Yeah.
type A and performance oriented to intentionally take a step back and get less fit, which is exactly what we're saying to do. Like we want you to get less
Mhm.
fit for a short period of time. And that sounds scary, but it's we always have to like zoom out and look at a much bigger picture and keep everything in the proper context. And in training, if we go back to just overload and recovery, it's sometimes it's 3 steps forward, it's 1 step back, 4 steps forward, 1 step back. And in this case, it's like, okay, we took 4 steps forward. Now we're going to take 2 or 3 steps back. It's that time where we need to do that. And that's going to build it like we're going to have a foundation and we can leverage that so that we can continue to take more and more steps forwards without fewer steps back. And so
Yeah.
just got to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. It helps us get over the scariness of the concept.
100% agree. It's 1,000% scary for a lot of people who are super vested into this whole process and are emotionally wrapped up in it. Like if you like being an endurance athlete, that's it. But I do think, just as you pointed out, Cliff, a good coach will walk you through that. I think for a self-coached athlete, it's a lot harder, right, to separate from those emotions. And so, Cliff, with your athletes, I mean, do you have kind of like the do's and don'ts of Coach Cliff's way to do this thing? And if you do, let's hear them.
Awesome. We'll start with the do's. I think the obvious one here is that we just need to highlight and emphasize is rest. Like when
Mm-hmm.
we go into this training phase, and I will call it a training phase, we're being very intentional with something. It is an aspect of training. And we need to prioritize rest over anything else. And so if you're, waking up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning to fit your ride in for the day, like that's time in the bank that you get to now reinvest back into a little bit more sleep. Or maybe it's a morning routine where you're spending, with your spouse or reading a book. So that's the most important thing is that we need to be very intentional about rest here, because if we just fill in that training with other busyness and we're not sleeping enough, we've kind of defeated the whole purpose of this. The second thing to really emphasize is active recovery via cross training. This is a really good time to go out and explore some different sports. For my runners, I have everybody. I like to get them on the bike. That's a big thing for us. And you can always jump in the pool. You can, if yoga's your thing, do that. Um, but find something to kind of fill your time. Stay active. Um, just make sure that it's active recovery, right? So it needs to be that extremely easy effort, short duration. Cyclists, you guys can always come jump on the trails with us.
Yeah, we can, but we'll have some good DOMs right after we do, and that's kind of the point of kind of take this thing easy at first. Like for cyclists who want to go hiking, I got a realization of this when we took a trip to Alaska. I just jammed into it. I did not prepare for it at all, but we were doing like 4,000 foot of elevation gain hikes, which means you have to come down 4,000 foot. Couldn't walk, man. I
Yeah, that
could not
eccentric
walk. Yeah,
loading will destroy you.
blew me up in my prime. But to that point, like if you're taking something new up, even if it is yoga, for a cyclist, like we're hardened endurance athletes aerobically, but our musculature is not well equipped for some of these new activities. So don't go crazy, right? Take your time and learn. But the other beneficial thing here is actually learning new activities, meeting other people through this cross training modality, and the process of learning new movement patterns is wildly important and healthy for your brain. So as you do take something else up, and maybe you carry that through, right? Maybe you carry a yoga practice through, or maybe you do stay on the trails a little bit more just for some overall aerobic cross training year round. Either way, go slow if it's new during this detraining transition phase.
Yeah, which kind of leads me to another good practice during this training phase is to go see a physical therapist if you don't have one in your corner already. Go get analyzed and spend a little bit of time with whether it be modality or mobility or uh, like you said, learning good movement patterns. You can learn a lot from a good assessment like that you can now incorporate into all of your training going forward to just help you move better as a human being in general. That will certainly
Yeah.
influence your performance in your particular sport.
Yep, I will second that. And for anyone who say doesn't have a good PT in their area, or they want to stay kind of remote based, I've done several podcasts with Erin Carson, who is CSCS like myself, and she's a strength coach up in Boulder, who works with triathletes, runners, cyclists, and Google Erin Carson Boulder, you'll find her. Go on the podcast and look for Erin Carson, her episodes, and that'll walk you through how she does some of that. But her famous quote is, "I stopped training muscles a long time ago, and now I stopped training athletes a long time ago. I now train movement patterns." So,
Love it.
just yeah, moving properly will actually help you out quite a bit.
Yeah, I always tell people after you get a coach in your corner, the next specialist you need to bring in on board onto your team is a good PT. Another good practice is to adjust your nutrition. And so
Hmm.
with this like massive reduction in workload, your demands are just going to change. And so I always tell athletes, especially after big events, like, hey, you know what? Don't worry about it. Like right off the bat, like especially this first week, maybe even the first 2 weeks. Like you need to get caught up, especially for my ultra runners that just maybe ran 100 miles or these crazy people that are running 200 plus miles. Like you don't even need to think about nutrition. You just need to eat. And that's going to be like one of the best things you can do for your recovery. But at some point in this phase, whether it's 2 weeks or 5 weeks, we do have to realize that our output is significantly dropped and we need to kind of match the demands a little bit. And that's whenever you can be a little bit more strategic, not only with just total energy intake, but also just the macronutrient makeups still need to be eating carbohydrates, but maybe your sources of carbohydrates can change a little bit. Maybe your total macronutrients can change a little bit. So I won't get too much into that. That's a little bit outside of my scope of practice, but it's something that you should be paying attention to.
Yeah, and we've talked about that on the podcast before. I'm not scared to go there. Simply drop your carbohydrate intake down a little bit, folks. And we've got some podcasts coming out on that, including, well, we already had one with Kristen Armstrong, so you can check on that. But decrease carbohydrate intake, increase fat, keep protein the same. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. And what Coach Cliff was saying, change up carbohydrate sources. Like just explore different grains. Like if you're always hitting pasta during the season, start looking at stuff like bulgur or oats or kefta, I think is another like Egyptian grain. I mean, go to the grain section and just like grab some stuff you don't know how to pronounce. Start trying it out. Change it up.
Love it. Try some
Yeah.
new vegetables too.
Yes. Eat more plants. Still eat animals. Don't get me wrong, but eat
Right.
more of those. Yeah. Cliff, one thing I don't know if this is a do or don't, and I don't know if we're getting into the don'ts right now, but what if I've got that like door jamb that needs some repair or like the
Mhm.
birdhouse that needs to be put up and I now have all this time period? Should I just like jam into that nonstop? Where are we at with like the honey-do list?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I initially, as I was thinking through this, had it on my do list, but I think it could fall into the don't list as well, right? Because, um,
Toes the line of both, I think.
yeah, I think it can fit into both categories here because with anything else, with us endurance athletes, we can be excessive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, at some point, if these honeydew lists or these projects that you're taking on, if they are physically or mentally taxing, then may not be the best time to take these on. But
Yeah.
certainly, we can definitely reinvest a lot of that training time that we've had into some of these projects. Um, you know, my wife, she always finds it funny that whenever I go through these periods, which I'm currently in at the moment, it's like, well, my production around the house with how much I'm helping with getting kids ready for school and cleaning and all of that, like significantly skyrockets. I got all this
Yeah.
energy. I'm suddenly just I'm a better husband and father.
Yeah.
But I do think it's a good time to be, just be intentional about those things because especially in peak volume, those things can be neglected and, our
Mhm.
spouses may have to really pick up, in our absence in those cases.
Seasons for sure, and we kind of say toe the line. These are both do and don'ts. I think like if you just ran 100 miles on Sunday and then Monday you're gonna dive into the building your deck or something, um, maybe pump the brakes there a little bit, right? And kind of like with the food and all this, like take some time to unwind and then ease into that. And for all that stuff, I would say now it is a good time. Just don't be crazy with it, like I sometimes do too. Which is like you start in on something mid morning, you forget to eat lunch because you're just like, no, I got to get this thing done, and you should almost like treat it like a race itself, and you just like want to get it done that day, and you can finish it tomorrow. But hell no, I'm not gonna you know what I mean? So like bring some balance to all of this too.
Yeah, I think we
So
can
that
just hit the common sense button, right? It's like, well,
for sure.
what is my purpose here? Like, why am I going through this period? Well, I need to recover and I need to bounce back from this, race or this big training cycle. Then is this making me tired? Do I feel exhausted? Is this interfering
Mhm.
with my, joy? And if that's the case, then like, stop, do
Yeah.
something else.
So how about your don'ts? What are on the don'ts list?
Yeah, kind of in that same vein, excessive training, right?
Yeah.
So, and we kind of touched on this a little bit, whether it be a honeydew list, projects, or all of a sudden we find this new sport and we're like, oh, this is awesome. I love swimming. Well, don't just replace your normal training volume with a new sport. um, don't go trash your quads on a massive downhill. If you're not,
Yeah.
if your quads aren't seasoned for that, as your example earlier. So I think excessive training is a big one. Just remember your purpose in this season is to recover and rest. I think another thing that I would really caution athletes to stay away from is just obsession over metrics. And I know probably with the audience that we have right now, that's a big one, right? Is I know cyclists love their metrics, and I geek out on it too. I think it's cool, it's fun, but I think that there needs to be a time period where we are hyper focused on those things and in tune with metrics and data. And I think there needs to be a time period where we can step away from it and not be so dependent on it. And I'm probably a little bit too reliable on it to go for a run without my watch. I just that doesn't interest me, as a lot of people might
Hmm.
suggest you should do, but I certainly won't be paying attention to my CPL going down. It's irrelevant.
Yeah.
Um, I understand that during this time frame, my resting heart rate or my HRV may be a little bit off. If I've all of a sudden have cut my training load significantly low, my body's in a little bit of a shock right now. Not going to obsess over that. I'm not going to worry about that. I'm not going to let it dictate what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's good to just step back in all aspects of training and all aspects of life.
To all those cyclists that look at their, what would be like a negative ramp rate daily, that's probably like the worst thing to look at.
Yes.
And a practical bit that I've been having some athletes, and I even did this myself just to kind of prove it to some of these athletes, because I was like, here, I do it too. If you have like a Wahoo or a Garmin, whatever, put your screen to time of day. If you want to capture the data, absolutely, because we want to see accurately what some of these metrics were postpartum, right? Like after the fact. But you don't have to look at this. It doesn't have to be in your face while you're doing it. You don't need to check in on heart rate to know. And this is kind of to your point, like learn your rate of perceived effort. And hopefully we're there by now. But just look at have it time of day, capture the data. Away we go.
Yeah. I think that's sound advice too for even racing, right? So I think a lot of times we can just obsess, and that becomes a detriment to performance. And so I tell a lot of my athletes just to turn their watch to time of day.
Cliff, what if one of your athletes said, cool, 4 weeks, I don't have to do anything. Peace out.
Yeah, so that's not the worst case scenario. I think that's probably a better alternative than what we just talked about. I think that's better than going out and overtraining in this phase. I think that we can probably be a little bit more strategic though, and I think we can better utilize our time while we're intentionally taking a step back and intentionally detraining. We still want to hold on to some of that, right? And we still want to make sure that we position ourselves well for the next training cycle. And so by going out and doing something, having some level of consistency is going to position us well for the future. But I would say too that if there's certain circumstances that is a need or maybe a net gain, then I think that should be on the table and should be discussed between the coach and the athlete and all invested parties. Like maybe this is where the family has a little bit more say than usual on the training process. If your relationships have suffered because of your training, that might be a really good indication that you probably should take a little bit more aggressive detraining phase and invest in some of the things that matter the most.
Yeah, I'll take a decreased CTL if that means I have an increased relationship, for sure.
Absolutely.
How do your athletes, how would our audience know if it's been long enough of a detraining phase?
Sure. So we discussed, some of the timelines and timeframes that align or congruent with just like the physical aspects of not detraining too much. But I think that, our intuition should be a major decision maker here. Excitability, right? Like, are we actually excited to go get on the bike again? Are we excited to set new goals? Are we excited to see what the next year of training is going to look like? And are we excited about going out and hammering some hard intervals? And if we can be like, yeah, I'm ready to go, then that's a really good indication that, okay, I think if we're, within certain boundaries, those physical boundaries that we discussed, that intuition is a really good indication that it's time to get going again. Occasionally going to have the one-offs where athletes are like, yeah, just crushed my A race for the year, and like 2 days later, I'm ready to go, and we might need to put a little bit of a yield sign up. But for the most part, the mind and the body is really good about providing us the right feedback as to when we're ready to get back into training.
Yeah, and I'm going to go a little off script here, just a quick delineation, but I think we all had those athletes that had either an injury or time away, like a bunch of travel for work, and maybe we never had the season that we wanted to, right? So if you've got an athlete coming into this kind of like time period, October, November, North America, and they're like, hey, you know, I missed a whole month of training here and there, right? Like, do I really need a detraining phase? What would you say if one of your athletes ask you that?
Yeah, so like any good coach, I'll say it depends, right? So
Right.
certainly depends on all the factors when we're looking at an athlete as a human being. But I would say that if the relationships haven't suffered, if they're in a really good place, if they didn't go through a whole lot of, if they're a good mental place and they didn't go through a whole lot of training stress because of all the mistraining, then
Hmm.
maybe this is a good opportunity to keep the training load up a little bit, and kind of transition right into the next season. But certainly depends on a lot of different factors.
And really, I somewhat get excited, especially if it's a time crunched athlete coming into like this time period, if we can keep on training in some regard, because really what we're talking about is moving on to a base period, right? And so I want to talk about how to move on and how to transition into base now. But if I have an athlete in that spot, I essentially get a longer runway for base, which I would argue is better for all endurance athletes. So even if you are like as an audience member listening to this, be like, oh, is it bad to do my base training now? Do I need a break? No, just do base training now. But Cliff, how would you transition someone from a detraining into a base training period?
Yeah, so base training is kind of an interesting topic on the trail and ultra running side because base training can essentially be a race specific phase for us when our our intensity
Yeah,
is so low. But yeah, so
yeah.
transitioning back into some some normalcy of like normal volume aerobic development. We really need to look at the three tools that we have in order to drive adaptations: frequency, volume, and intensity. And we need to be able to leverage and utilize those tools. So the first thing we want to do is just take care of the frequency. We want to get back up to an optimal days of training in the specific modality that we're training for. So in this instance, getting back on the bike. So if you're training 6 days a week and that's normal for you, getting back up to 6 days a week. The next would be to conservatively improve or increase the volume to an ideal level, and getting back up to those zone two rides, spending a little bit more time in the saddle, extending out the weekend long ride and such. And then with the intensity piece, you can probably add a little bit better context on the cycling side. But for the runners, what I like to do is introduce like small doses of frequency just to kind of prepare the body for upcoming training phases. And that may not be enough time at intensity to really elicit any meaningful physiological adaptations. So kind of what I'm getting at here in the running world is strides. So I might
Hmm.
incorporate like 20 to 30-second strides at like a VO2 max effort. And that's not enough time to really, produce any meaningful adaptations for that intensity. But it's just preparing the body and the mind to get like, okay, we're getting back into routine. We're getting back into real training again, structured training. And that's kind of a good segue and leadway into the next training phases.
Exactly. And I would say on the cycling side of things, a couple things I would do separate from strength training to add in some of that intensity. Because if we are lifting heavy at that point, typically it's enough and I'm just riding zone two. But if I'm going to incorporate some meaningful structure, I'll do one of two things. One, and I add this in for a lot of athletes, but I work on cadence, so it's very similar to the idea of why you're prescribing running strides. It's a lot of leg speed, and for us, it's a neuromuscular adaptation. So I want the athlete to get really good at high cadence work. And I call them VO2 aerobic intervals, not VO2 max intervals, because we're doing this only around like tempo or sub threshold, and it's high cadence, 100 plus, and I'll go up to wherever it's smooth. And I'll have a block of that. And I typically find that it improves the athlete's ability to produce power on whatever scale of leg speed. And typically higher is better. So that's one way to do it. The other one is if I do have an athlete who detrained well, we're building base back up and they have a weakness, I'll work on it then. For example, a really good climber may be not so good anaerobically, so I'll incorporate some short, really hard stuff. But as you said, nothing that's going to make you like really tired. But we're going to hit that high end of and try to pull that up in a time period where it doesn't matter, so that if we come into a time period when it does matter, it's slightly higher. All right, Cliff, well, let's take this thing home with a couple summary points. I guess the first one that comes to mind for me is, as we started this whole podcast, like having a period of less training or detraining is very important for long-term performance gains as well as just overall health. What else would you like to add to our summary points?
Kind of going back to our earlier talking point of purposeful, intentional, but it needs to be longer in duration, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
it's not a recovery week, I think, as you mentioned, but it's an actual training phase that's a necessary process for long-term growth and development.
And then I would say after you've had a successful detraining phase, I mean, you want to transition to base simply and not too quickly. You can pull on the threads of frequency, volume, and intensity. Do it appropriately, but just ease back in. Don't go too crazy, too fast. And it's also a time period where you can incorporate training for some of the weaknesses that you may not be able to train later on in the season. So, that's the summary for today. I do think detraining should be embraced by all endurance athletes a little bit more than it is. I think the research that's coming out has helped to identify that a little bit better in terms of doing it with confidence. And so I'll incorporate those into our show notes with just like links to resources. And for people who have been listening here, they're like, wait, what? There are links to resources? Yes, there are. So go to the landing page at trainright.com/podcast. You'll find it there. You'll also go on like Apple Podcasts or Google Play, wherever you listen to your stuff. And it's right there on the landing page for each episode. But Cliff, before I let you get back to your 4 kids, director of over 60 athletes around the world, being a husband and an athlete, shameless plug for anybody who loves the Cliff Pittman way of coaching. How do they reach out to you? Are you taking on clients right now? How do they get more Cliff in their life?
Yeah. So I think the best way to connect is through Instagram. I'm pretty active on there. The handle is just at Coach Cliff Pittman, and would love to interact with anybody there. I'm not currently taking on any athletes at the moment, just because
Okay.
of all the reasons you mentioned. With that's all on my plate. But of course, I will help facilitate if you reach out to me, I will certainly help facilitate getting you in touch with the right coach that would be a good fit for you and the coach. Yeah, and then also you can plug into, I write a monthly column for Trail Runner magazine, and so a lot of those concepts apply to cyclists. Like I just one just published today on, should you be training by heart rate or perceived exertion? Like, and obviously in the cycling crowd, it's very power heavy, and rightfully so. But I kind of go into that article on why power meters aren't quite as effective in running. But anyways, yeah, that's another medium that you can plug into to get content.
Yeah. See, I'm learning here too. I did not know you do a weekly on that. So send that over to me and I will put it
Yep,
in the show notes, Cliff. And
absolutely.
for audience members, thank you for tuning in to another time crunched athlete podcast. And Cliff, thank you for your precious time that you gave today.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was fun.